When I fainted at my son's school play, the hospital called my parents. They never came. Instead, they called my sister to tell her I was being dramatic again. And that single phone call unraveled 38 years of family lies I had been too exhausted to see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The auditorium smelled like industrial floor cleaner, and the particular must that accumulates in any building filled with children. I remember that detail with strange clarity, the way trauma has of crystallizing certain sensory information while blurring everything else. The elementary school stage was decorated with hand-painted cardboard trees, their green tempera paint still slightly tacky under the hot stage lights. Parents filled the folding chairs in uneven rows, phones already raised to capture their children's moments of glory or awkwardness, whichever came first. My son Marcus was playing the role of the Cowardly Lion in his third-grade production of The Wizard of Oz. He was 9 years old, small for his age, with my dark hair and his father's serious brown eyes. His father, David, had been gone for 6 years by then, killed in a construction accident that left us with insurance money that ran out faster than grief and a mortgage I could barely manage on a medical transcriptionist's salary. Marcus had practiced his lines every night for 3 weeks, pacing our small living room in Gilbert, Arizona, wearing a costume tail I had sewn from fabric remnants and wire hangers. I had been feeling off all morning, a persistent lightheadedness that I attributed to skipping breakfast and the relentless Arizona heat even though we were well into October. The truth was that I had been feeling progressively worse for weeks, maybe months, but I had developed the particular skill that single mothers perfect out of necessity, the ability to ignore your own body's distress signals because there is simply no time or money to address them. I worked from home transcribing medical records, which meant I had health insurance in theory but a deductible so high that actually using it required the kind of financial crisis I was constantly working to avoid. The play began at 7 in the evening. Marcus had insisted I sit in the third row, close enough that he could see me but not so close that it would embarrass him in front of his classmates. I had arrived 20 minutes early, claiming the aisle seat he had specified, and I waited as the auditorium filled with the particular chaos of elementary school family events. I watched other parents arrive in pairs and groups, grandparents with cameras, siblings already bored, whole extended family systems mobilizing to witness a child's small moment of importance. I had invited my parents to the play 3 weeks earlier during one of our increasingly rare phone conversations. My mother had responded with her characteristic vague affirmation, saying they would try to make it if nothing came up. My father had been silent in the background, which I had learned to interpret as passive refusal. My sister Vanessa, who lived just 15 minutes away in Chandler, had not responded to my text message about the play at all. This absence was unremarkable enough that I barely registered disappointment. I had long since adjusted my expectations regarding my family's participation in my life or Marcus's childhood. The lights dimmed and the piano music began, played somewhat uncertainly by a parent volunteer whose timing was ambitious. Dorothy appeared on stage, pigtails swinging, and the audience settled into attentive appreciation. I felt the lightheadedness intensify, a swimming sensation that made the stage lights seem to pulse and blur. I gripped the metal edge of the folding chair and told myself it would pass. I had experienced similar episodes before, moments when my vision tunneled and my heart seemed to beat in my throat, and they always passed if I just remained still and breathed carefully. Marcus made his entrance in the third scene, his costume tail dragging slightly across the stage floor. He delivered his first line with the careful pronunciation of a child who had memorized something phonetically without fully understanding its meaning. I felt a surge of overwhelming love and pride, the kind that temporarily obliterates everything else, and I smiled even as the auditorium seemed to tilt slightly on an axis that should not exist. The last thing I remember clearly was Marcus saying his line about courage, about wanting the wizard to give him what he lacked. Then the floor seemed to rush up toward my face, and the industrial cleaner smell intensified, and someone nearby made a startled sound that might have been a scream or might have been my own consciousness trying to alert me to what was happening. I learned later that I had slumped forward out of my chair and onto the floor between the rows. The play stopped immediately. Marcus saw me fall from the stage, his face visible in the sudden confusion of lights and movement. A teacher who had been standing at the back of the auditorium, and who had some emergency medical training came forward quickly and checked my pulse and breathing. Someone called 911 while another parent cleared space around me and elevated my feet. The entire careful choreography of the school play dissolved into the more urgent choreography of emergency response. I regained consciousness briefly in the ambulance, aware of movement and voices but unable to focus on anything specific. A paramedic was asking me questions about medications and medical history, and I was trying to answer but my mouth would not form words properly. I remember being aware that I needed to tell someone to take care of Marcus, that he could not be left at the school, that he would be frightened and confused. I managed to communicate something about my son, and the paramedic assured me that someone from the school was handling it, that I should not worry, that I needed to focus on staying calm. The emergency room at Mercy Gilbert Medical Center was the particular kind of organized chaos that occurs during evening hours when the day's accumulated injuries and illnesses converge with the dinner hour accidents and the early manifestations of conditions that people spent all day ignoring. I was brought in through the ambulance bay and transferred to a gurney in a curtained examination area. Nurses moved with efficient speed, attaching monitors and inserting in 4-line while asking me the same questions the paramedic had asked. I was more coherent now, able to provide my name and date of birth and insurance information, able to explain that I lived alone with my 9-year-old son who had been at the school play when I collapsed. The nurse, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and no-nonsense efficiency, asked if there was someone she should call. I gave her my parents' phone number first, the landline they had maintained in the same house in Mesa where I had grown up. My mother answered on the third ring, and I could hear the nurse explaining the situation, her voice professionally calm but conveying the necessary urgency. I could hear my mother's voice through the phone, too distant to make out words but recognizable in its cadence and tone. The nurse listened for a moment, said something else I could not quite hear, and then ended the call. She returned to my bedside and told me that my mother said they would come as soon as they could. The nurse's expression was neutral, professional, giving nothing away about whether she found the response adequate or concerning. She asked if there was anyone else, and I gave her Vanessa's number, my sister who was geographically closest and who I thought might at least be willing to pick up Marcus from wherever the school had taken him. The next hour passed in the particular suspended time of medical evaluation. Blood was drawn. An electrocardiogram was performed. A doctor who looked young enough to still be in residency examined me and asked detailed questions about my symptoms leading up to the collapse. I explained the weeks of fatigue and lightheadedness, the difficulty catching my breath after minor exertion, the way my heart sometimes seemed to skip beats or race without explanation. The doctor's expression grew more serious as I described these symptoms, and he ordered additional tests including a chest X-ray and an echocardiogram. I asked repeatedly about Marcus, and each time a different nurse assured me that someone from the school was with him, that he was safe, that they would bring him to the hospital as soon as the immediate evaluation was complete. I felt the particular guilt that defines single parenthood, the constant awareness that your child's security rests entirely on your continued functioning, and that any disruption to your health or capacity creates immediate crisis for someone who has no redundancy in their support system. 2 hours after I arrived at the emergency room, a social worker appeared at my bedside. She introduced herself as Patricia Mendez, and her presence signaled something beyond routine medical care. She pulled a chair close to my gurney and asked me about my support system, about who was available to help with Marcus, about my living situation and financial resources. I answered her questions with increasing anxiety, recognizing that these were the questions asked when someone's capacity to care for their child was being evaluated. Patricia explained that Marcus was in a family waiting area with a school counselor who had accompanied him from the elementary school. She said he was frightened but physically fine, that he had asked about me repeatedly, and that they had explained I was being treated but was conscious and stable. She asked again about family members who might be available, and I repeated what I had already told the nurses about my parents and my sister. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Patricia excused herself and returned 15 minutes later with information that reconfigured my understanding of the evening. She sat down again and spoke carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone trained to deliver difficult information. She explained that the hospital had made multiple attempts to reach both my parents and my sister. My parents' phone line had been answered twice, once by my mother and once by my father, and both times they had been informed of my hospitalization and asked to come to the hospital or to make arrangements for Marcus. Neither had come. Neither had called back to check on my condition. My sister Vanessa had answered her phone on the first call, and had listened to the explanation of the situation. According to Patricia, Vanessa had said that I had a history of exaggerating medical problems for attention, that I was probably fine, and that she could not leave her own children to deal with my drama. When the hospital called again an hour later to explain that I was being admitted for cardiac evaluation, and that Marcus needed immediate placement with a family member, Vanessa had let the call go to voicemail. Patricia watched my face as she delivered this information, and I worked to keep my expression neutral even as something fundamental cracked inside my chest. The physical sensation was so intense that I glanced at the cardiac monitor beside my bed to see if it registered this emotional rupture as a medical event. The nurse who had been periodically checking my vital signs noticed my distress and adjusted something in my foreline, probably a mild sedative, and I felt a chemical calm descend over the sharp edges of what I was feeling. The practical problem remained. I was being admitted to the hospital for observation and further cardiac testing. Marcus could not stay in the family waiting area indefinitely. Patricia explained the options with professional gentleness. If I could not identify a family member or close friend who could take temporary custody, the hospital would need to contact Child Protective Services to arrange emergency foster placement until I was medically cleared to resume care. The thought of Marcus being placed with strangers, of him experiencing that level of abandonment and fear after already witnessing me collapse at his school play, mobilized something in me that overrode the medication and the physical weakness. I forced my mind to work through the fog of exhaustion and fear and betrayal. I thought through every person I knew in Arizona, every casual friendship or professional relationship that might contain enough goodwill to bridge this crisis. I thought of my neighbor, Mrs. Chun, who sometimes watched Marcus for an hour after school if I had a medical appointment. She was in her 70s and her English was limited, and I could not ask her to take responsibility for my son overnight in a situation this uncertain. I thought of Marcus's best friend's mother, Ashley, who I knew only through brief conversations at school pickup, and who had her own complicated life that I had no right to disrupt. I thought through my coworkers, all of whom I knew only through email and the occasional video call, none of whom I had ever met in person. Then I remembered Claire Hoffman, my supervisor at the medical transcription company where I worked. Claire and I had never met face-to-face as the entire company operated remotely, but we had worked together for 6 years. She lived in Scottsdale, about 45 minutes away depending on traffic. She had mentioned during one of our video calls that she had raised her own children as a single mother after her husband's death, and there had been something in the way she spoke about that experience that suggested a depth of understanding about the particular challenges of solo parenting. I asked Patricia if I could have my phone, which had been placed in a plastic bag with my other belongings. My hand shook as I scrolled through my contacts to find Claire's cell number. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night, well outside normal business hours, and I had no idea if she would even answer a call from me at this time. The phone rang 4 times and I was preparing to leave what would have been an absurdly desperate voicemail when Claire answered, her voice alert and concerned. I explained the situation as concisely as I could manage, fighting against the sedative that was making my words feel thick and slow. I told her about collapsing at Marcus's play, about being admitted to the hospital for cardiac evaluation, about my family's refusal to help, about the immediate need for someone to take Marcus for at least the night and possibly longer depending on my medical situation. I heard my own voice break as I asked if there was any possibility she could help, and I hated the sound of my own desperation but had no resources left for pride. Claire did not hesitate. She asked for the hospital address and said she would be there within the hour. She told me not to worry, that Marcus would be safe with her, that I should focus on my health and let her handle everything else. She asked if Marcus had any medical conditions or dietary restrictions she should know about, whether he had homework that needed to be completed, what his morning routine looked like. The practical specificity of her questions, the immediate shift into problem-solving mode, made something in my chest unclench slightly. I gave Patricia permission to release Marcus to Claire when she arrived, and I provided Claire's contact information for the hospital's records. Then there was nothing to do but wait. They moved me from the emergency room to a cardiac observation unit on the 4th floor. The room was small and dimly lit with a window that looked out over the parking lot. I could see the lights of cars arriving and departing, ordinary people moving through ordinary evenings, while my own life seemed to be revealing itself as far more fragile and unsupported than I had allowed myself to acknowledge. A nurse came in to adjust my monitors and explained that I would be having an echocardiogram first thing in the morning, and possibly a stress test depending on those results. She was matter-of-fact and kind, explaining that they were being cautious given my age and symptoms, but that many cardiac issues were manageable with medication and lifestyle changes. She told me I should try to sleep, that rest was important for cardiac recovery, and I almost laughed at the impossibility of that suggestion. Claire arrived at the hospital at 11:15. Patricia brought her up to my room first so I could see her with Marcus and provide whatever reassurance I could manage. Marcus looked small and frightened, his cowardly lion costume now in a plastic bag that Claire was carrying. His eyes were red from crying and his hair was disheveled from what I imagined had been hours of anxious fidgeting. When he saw me in the hospital bed with all the monitors and 4 lines, his face crumpled and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. I held out my arms and he came to the bedside carefully, afraid to touch me as if I might break further. I pulled him into as much of an embrace as the 4 lines and monitor wires would allow and told him I was going to be fine, that the doctors were just being extra careful, that he was going to stay with Miss Claire for a little while until I could come home. He asked me when that would be and I could not give him a definite answer, which felt like another failure in an evening of compounding failures. Claire stood back respectfully during this exchange, and when I looked at her over Marcus's head I saw something in her expression that was not pity but rather recognition, the look of someone who had stood in similar rooms with similar fears. She stepped forward when Marcus finally released me and placed her hand briefly on my shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that required no words. They left after Patricia assured Marcus multiple times that he could call me in the morning, and that I would be able to talk to him as much as he wanted. I watched them walk down the hallway, Marcus's small hand in Claire's, and I felt the full weight of what had just occurred settle over me like a physical pressure. My parents had been called and told their daughter was in the hospital. They had not come. My sister had been told her nephew needed immediate care. She had not come. The only person who had responded to my crisis was someone I had never met in person, someone whose only connection to me was a professional relationship that she had every right to keep bounded and limited. The nursing staff changed shifts at midnight, and a new nurse came in to check my vital signs and ask the standard questions about pain levels and comfort. She noticed that I was not sleeping and asked if I needed something to help with that. I accepted whatever she offered, too exhausted to maintain the pretense that I was managing. The medication pulled me under gradually, and my last conscious thought was a question I could not answer about why the people who were supposed to love me had found it so easy to stay away. I woke to gray morning light filtering through the thin hospital curtains, and the immediate disorientation of not knowing what time it was or how long I had slept. A different nurse was in the room adjusting something on one of the monitors, and she smiled when she saw I was awake. She told me it was 6:30 in the morning, that the cardiologist would be making rounds within the hour, and that I was scheduled for an echocardiogram at 8 o'clock. She asked if I wanted breakfast and I discovered I was hungry despite everything, which seemed like either a good sign or evidence of my body's fundamental disconnection from my emotional reality. The cardiologist was a woman in her 60s with silver hair, and in manner that balanced efficiency with warmth. She introduced herself as Dr. Rachel Kwan and explained that she had reviewed my emergency room records and overnight monitoring data. She asked me to describe again the symptoms I had been experiencing in the weeks leading up to my collapse, and I found myself able to articulate them more clearly now, perhaps because the immediate crisis had passed or perhaps because I was finally taking them seriously. Dr. Kwan performed a physical examination, listening to my heart and lungs with careful attention. She explained that my initial test results showed some concerning irregularities that warranted further investigation. The echocardiogram would provide detailed images of my heart structure and function, and depending on those results we would determine next steps. She spoke to me the way I imagine she spoke to all her patients, with straightforward honesty that did not catastrophize but also did not minimize. The echocardiogram was scheduled in the hospital's cardiac imaging department. A transport worker came to wheel my bed through the hallways, and I watched the ceiling tiles pass overhead and thought about how being a patient strips you of autonomy in ways both necessary and demeaning. The test itself was painless, involving a technician moving an ultrasound wand across my chest, while images of my heart appeared on a screen. I could not interpret what I was seeing, but I watched the technician's face for clues about whether what she was observing was routine or concerning. She maintained professional neutrality, completing the test efficiently and telling me the results would be sent to Dr. Kwan within the hour. Back in my room, I was finally able to call Marcus. Claire answered her phone immediately and told me they were just finishing breakfast. Marcus got on the line and asked me a dozen questions in rapid succession about when I was coming home and whether I was still sick and whether the doctors had fixed whatever was wrong. I answered as reassuringly as I could while being honest that I did not yet know when I would be discharged. Claire took the phone back and told me that Marcus had slept reasonably well considering the circumstances, that he had eaten a good breakfast, and that she had already contacted his school to explain his absence. She told me not to worry about anything, to focus on getting better, and that she would bring Marcus to visit that afternoon if the hospital allowed it. After the call ended, I lay in the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling and allowed myself to think about what I had been avoiding since Patricia had delivered the information about my family's response. My parents had been called and told I was hospitalized with a cardiac emergency. They had not come to the hospital. They had not called to check on my condition. They had not offered to help with Marcus. The same parents who had driven 3 hours to attend my sister Vanessa's daughter's dance recital last month had not driven 30 minutes to see if their own daughter might be dying. My sister, who lived 15 minutes away and who I had helped financially more times than I could count, had characterized my cardiac emergency as dramatic attention-seeking. She had refused to care for her nephew for even one night during a legitimate medical crisis. The pattern was so clear, so undeniable, that I could not understand how I had failed to see it with this clarity before. Or perhaps I had seen it but had developed elaborate mechanisms for explaining it away, for making it my responsibility, for believing that if I just tried harder or needed less or asked more carefully, the response would be different. Dr. Kwan returned to my room mid-morning with the echocardiogram results and a diagnosis that reframed everything. She explained that I had a condition called peripartum cardiomyopathy, a form of heart failure that can develop during pregnancy or in the months following delivery. In my case, it had apparently developed after Marcus's birth 9 years ago, but had gone undiagnosed because I had attributed my symptoms to the normal exhaustion of new motherhood, and then to the stress of single parenting after David died. The condition had been progressing slowly, my heart muscle gradually weakening, until the stress of my current life circumstances had pushed it to the point of acute failure. Dr. Kwan explained the treatment plan with the same straightforward clarity she had demonstrated earlier. I would need to start several medications immediately to reduce the workload on my heart and prevent further deterioration. I would need to make significant lifestyle modifications including rest, stress reduction, and careful monitoring of fluid intake. I would need regular follow-up appointments and possibly additional interventions if the medications were not sufficient. She emphasized that this was a serious condition, but that with appropriate treatment and compliance, many patients lived full and active lives. She also told me something that hit me with unexpected force. She said that my collapse at Marcus's school play had probably saved my life. If I had continued ignoring my symptoms for a few more weeks or months, I could have experienced complete heart failure, which carried a significant risk of sudden death. The school play, the public nature of my collapse, the immediate emergency response, all of it had forced me into the medical system at a point where intervention could still make a meaningful difference. I was discharged from the hospital on the third day with a bag full of medications, a folder full of instructions, and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the end of the week. Claire brought Marcus to pick me up, and he sat close to me in the back seat of her car with his hand gripping mine, as if physical contact might prevent me from disappearing again. Claire drove us home to our small rental house in Gilbert, and helped me get settled while Marcus hovered nearby, anxious and watchful. Before she left, Claire sat with me at the kitchen table while Marcus was in his room unpacking the overnight bag he had taken to her house. She told me something I had not known, which was that she had been hospitalized for a heart condition 20 years earlier when her own children were young. Her husband had been dead for 2 years at that point and she had been working multiple jobs to support her family. When she collapsed at work, her mother-in-law had refused to help with her children, claiming that Claire was neglecting them by working too much and that the health crisis was her own fault. Claire had spent 3 days in the hospital with no visitors except a coworker who barely knew her, but who had organized meal delivery and childcare among their colleagues. She told me this not to compare suffering but to let me know that she understood what it felt like to be that alone, to discover in your moment of greatest vulnerability that the people who should protect you have chosen not to. She told me that it had taken her years to stop making excuses for her mother-in-law's behavior, to stop believing that she had somehow failed to earn care that should have been offered freely. She said the turning point had been recognizing that she was teaching her children, through her own acceptance of mistreatment, that this was normal and acceptable, and that she needed to model something different if she wanted them to expect better in their own lives. After Claire left, I sat on the couch with Marcus beside me and allowed myself to acknowledge what I had been avoiding. My family's response to my medical emergency was not an isolated incident, or a misunderstanding, or a result of poor communication. It was the clearest possible demonstration of how they saw me and valued me, and no amount of rationalization could make it mean something different than what it plainly meant. They had known I was in the hospital with a cardiac emergency, and they had chosen not to come. That choice was complete information, requiring no additional context or explanation. That evening I did something I had never done before. I sat down at my kitchen table with a notebook and I wrote down every instance I could remember of being dismissed, minimized, or abandoned by my parents and my sister. The list grew longer than I expected, filling page after page with incidents I had explained away at the time but which formed a clear pattern when viewed collectively. The time my mother had canceled plans to watch Marcus so I could attend a required work training, claiming she had forgotten, and then had posted photos from Vanessa's daughter's birthday party that same day. The time my father had loaned Vanessa $10,000 for a failed business venture, but had told me he could not help with Marcus's medical bills because he needed to be fair to both daughters. The time Vanessa had asked me to babysit her 3 children overnight on 3 days' notice, and then had told people I had nothing else going on anyway since I did not have a real social life. The documentation was not for them. It was for me. It was to make undeniable what I had spent years pretending was ambiguous. That night I slept better than I had in weeks, despite the medications and the cardiac monitoring device I wore, and the fundamental uncertainty about my health. Something about finally seeing clearly, even when what you see is painful, releases you from the exhausting work of selective blindness. In the days that followed, my phone remained strangely silent. My parents did not call to check on my health or ask about my diagnosis. Vanessa did not reach out to apologize or explain. It was as if my medical emergency had simply not occurred, as if I had imagined the whole thing, except that I had the medications and the medical bills and the follow-up appointments to prove otherwise. Their silence was its own form of communication, telling me more clearly than words that they considered the matter closed, that they felt no obligation to acknowledge what had happened or their role in it. I went to my follow-up appointment with Dr. Kwan at the end of the week. She was pleased with how I was responding to the medications and told me that with continued treatment and lifestyle modification, my prognosis was good. She asked about my support system at home, and I found myself telling her the truth about my family's response, not because I was seeking sympathy but because she had asked a direct question and I was tired of protecting people who would not protect me. Dr. Kwan listened without interrupting, and then said something I did not expect. She told me that in her 30 years as a cardiologist, she had observed that patients with strong social support had measurably better outcomes than those who were isolated, but that toxic relationships created as much physiological stress as isolation, and sometimes more. She suggested that I consider working with a therapist as part of my cardiac recovery plan, to address the stress factors that were contributing to my condition. I took her suggestion seriously and scheduled an appointment with a therapist named Dr. Helen Marsh who specialized in family trauma and medical crisis. My insurance covered mental health services with a reasonable copay, and I recognized that I needed professional help to navigate what I was beginning to understand was not just a medical crisis, but a complete reconfiguration of my understanding of my family relationships. The work ahead was not just about managing my cardiac condition, but about building a life structure that did not depend on people who had demonstrated they were unwilling or unable to provide basic support during genuine crisis. Marcus went back to school the following Monday. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, pulled me aside during drop-off to ask how I was feeling, and to tell me that the school counselor was available if Marcus needed support processing what he had witnessed. She mentioned that several parents had asked about me, and had offered to help with meals or transportation if needed. These were people I barely knew, parents I exchanged pleasantries with at pickup but had never socialized with beyond school functions, and they had demonstrated more concern and offered more concrete assistance than my own family. That afternoon, while Marcus was at school and I was supposed to be resting, I received a phone call from my mother. It was the first contact from any family member since my hospitalization 12 days earlier. My mother's voice was cheerful, almost aggressively normal, as if nothing unusual had occurred. She asked how I was feeling in the tone someone might use to inquire about a mild cold. I responded that I had been in the hospital with heart failure, and was now on cardiac medications that I would need for the rest of my life. There was a brief pause, and then my mother said that she was glad I was feeling better, and that she was calling to remind me about Vanessa's birthday dinner next month, which was being held at a nice restaurant in Scottsdale and everyone would be expected to chip in for the bill. I sat in my quiet living room holding the phone and listening to my mother describe the restaurant and the planned menu and who would be attending, and I felt something shift inside me like tectonic plates finding a new configuration. I interrupted her mid-sentence and said one word, a word that carried all the weight of the previous 2 weeks and the 38 years before them. I said noted. My mother stopped talking, confused by the interruption and the tone. I told her I needed to go, that I would be in touch, and I ended the call before she could respond. I sat there for a long time afterward, my heart beating steadily in my chest, the organ that had nearly failed me now working hard to keep me alive. I thought about Marcus at school, learning that the cowardly lion found courage not because a wizard gave it to him, but because he discovered he had always possessed it. I thought about what I wanted my son to learn about how people should treat each other, about what family should mean, about when loyalty becomes self-destruction. And I understood that whatever happened next, I could not go back to pretending that everything was normal, or that I just needed to try harder to earn basic human consideration from people who had shown me clearly and repeatedly that they would not provide it. The hospital had called my parents and they had not come. That fact, simple and undeniable, had revealed something I needed to see. Now I needed to decide what to do with that knowledge, how to protect myself and my son, and how to build a life that did not break my heart in the pursuit of connection with people who could not or would not connect back. The story I am about to tell you is what happened next, how one medical emergency exposed 3 decades of dysfunction, and how I learned that sometimes the family you need is not the family you were born into but the one you choose to build from people who show up when it matters. If you have ever discovered that the people who should have loved you best actually valued you least, drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from tonight, because what happened after that phone call changed everything, and you need to understand how deep this went before I tell you what I did about it. The therapy session with Dr. Helen Marsh was scheduled for the following Thursday afternoon, during the window of time when Marcus was still at school, and I did not need to arrange childcare. Her office was located in a professional building in Tempe, just 20 minutes from my house, in a suite that felt deliberately calming with soft gray walls, and carefully selected artwork that suggested tranquility without being aggressively therapeutic. Dr. Marsh herself was a woman in her early 60s with close-cropped silver hair, and in directness that I found immediately reassuring after years of my family's indirect communication patterns. She began our first session by asking me to tell her what had brought me to therapy, and I found myself providing the clinical summary first as if I were transcribing someone else's medical record rather than describing my own life. I explained the cardiac diagnosis, the collapse at the school play, the hospitalization, and then finally the detail that felt most difficult to articulate, which was that my parents and sister had been notified of my medical emergency and had chosen not to respond. Dr. Marsh listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes but mostly maintaining steady eye contact that suggested she was tracking not just my words, but the emotional content beneath them. When I finished the basic narrative, Dr. Marsh asked me a question I had not anticipated. She asked whether this response from my family had surprised me. I started to say yes automatically, because of course it should have surprised me that parents would not come to the hospital when their daughter was experiencing heart failure. But as I sat with the question more honestly, I realized that while I had been hurt and angry, I had not actually been shocked. Some part of me had expected exactly this response, which was why I had immediately started problem-solving rather than waiting for them to arrive, why I had called Claire instead of assuming my family would handle things, why I had felt betrayed but not genuinely confused. Dr. Marsh nodded as if this admission confirmed something she had suspected, And she asked me to tell her about other times when my family had failed to show up for me in moments that mattered. The question opened something inside me that I had kept carefully contained. And for the next 40 minutes I described incident after incident spanning my entire life. I told her about being 12 years old and winning second place in the regional science fair. And my parents had missed the awards ceremony because they were attending Vanessa's soccer game, which was not even a championship or anything particularly important, just a regular season game that happened to be scheduled at the same time. I told her about graduating from college, the first person in my extended family to earn a 4-year degree, and my parents had arrived late to the ceremony and left immediately afterward because they needed to help Vanessa move into a new apartment across town. I described my wedding to David, a small ceremony at a courthouse followed by dinner at a modest restaurant, and how my mother had spent the entire meal talking about Vanessa's upcoming wedding, which would be a real celebration with a church ceremony and a reception hall and a proper white dress. I told her about David's funeral, about sitting in the front row of the service while my parents sat with Vanessa and her family several rows back, about how they had left before the reception at our house because they needed to take Vanessa's children home for their naps. I explained the pattern of financial assistance that flowed freely to Vanessa for business ventures and vacations and impulse purchases, while my requests for help with medical bills or car repairs were met with lectures about budgeting and living within my means. Dear Marsh listened to all of this with the focused attention of someone who was constructing a framework in real time, and when I finally stopped talking she sat quietly for a moment before speaking. She told me that what I was describing was a family system organized around a clear hierarchy, in which one child was designated as the priority, and the other was designated as the support structure. She explained that in such systems, the non-priority child often develops a set of adaptive behaviors designed to earn the care and attention that should be provided unconditionally. These behaviors typically include becoming excessively competent, minimizing your own needs, providing resources to others without expectation of reciprocity, and interpreting neglect as something you have somehow earned through insufficient effort. She asked me whether I recognized this pattern in myself, and I found that I could not speak for a moment because the recognition was so complete and so devastating. Every choice I had made in relation to my family suddenly looked different through this lens. My constant availability to help Vanessa, my financial support despite my own limited resources, my acceptance of last-minute cancellations and broken promises, my habit of explaining away their behavior as the result of being busy or forgetful or stressed, all of it had been an elaborate performance designed to prove I was worthy of basic consideration. And the fundamental problem with that performance was that it accepted the premise that my worth was conditional, that love and support were things to be earned through sufficient self-sacrifice rather than rights I possessed simply by existing. Dr. Marsh told me something that would stay with me through everything that followed. She said that my cardiac condition was a physical manifestation of an emotional reality, that my heart had been working overtime for 38 years trying to pump enough love and effort into a system that was designed to extract from me without reciprocating. She said that my treatment plan needed to address not just the medical aspects of heart failure, but the relational patterns that had created the chronic stress contributing to my condition. She emphasized that this was not about blame or assigning fault, but about recognizing reality clearly enough to make different choices going forward. We scheduled weekly sessions, and Dr. Marsh gave me homework that felt strange and uncomfortable. She asked me to keep a journal documenting every interaction with my family members, noting specifically the requests they made of me, the responses I gave, and the emotional impact of these exchanges. She told me that we needed data to work with, that one of the challenges of dysfunctional family systems was that they operated through accumulated small incidents that were individually deniable, but collectively devastating. The journal would help me see patterns that were otherwise easy to dismiss or rationalize. I started the journal that evening after putting Marcus to bed. The act of writing down interactions in real time, rather than filtering them through my usual mental processes of justification and minimization, was immediately revealing. Over the next week I documented 3 text messages from Vanessa asking me to watch her children on short notice, each request phrased as if she were doing me a favor by giving me the opportunity to spend time with my nieces and nephews. I documented a voicemail from my mother asking whether I had purchased my portion of the group birthday gift for my father, a gift I had not been consulted about but was apparently expected to contribute to at a cost of $150 that I could not easily spare given my new medical expenses. I documented a conversation with my father in which he had called to ask whether I still had the pressure washer he had loaned me 3 years earlier, and when I said yes, he told me he needed it back this weekend because Vanessa wanted to clean her driveway and it was easier for me to deliver it to her house than for him to pick it up from mine and then take it to hers. Each of these interactions, considered individually, seemed minor and possibly reasonable. But documented in sequence over a single week, they formed a clear pattern of expectation without reciprocity, of my time and resources being treated as communally available while theirs remained protected and bounded. The second therapy session focused on what Dr. Marsh called boundary setting, a term I had heard before but had never truly understood in practice. She explained that boundaries were not about controlling other people's behavior, but about deciding what you were willing to accept, and then communicating those limits clearly while following through with consequences when the limits were violated. She emphasized that people who were accustomed to unlimited access to your resources would interpret the establishment of boundaries as a hostile act, that their resistance to your limits was actually evidence that the limits were necessary. We role-played various scenarios in which I practiced saying no without justification or apology. Dr. Marsh played Vanessa asking me to babysit, and I practiced responding with a simple statement that I was not available rather than providing the detailed explanation of why I could not help that would give her opportunities to problem-solve around my objections or characterize my reasons as insufficient. The exercise felt absurdly difficult, and I found myself automatically generating justifications and apologies even in this artificial context. Dr. Marsh pointed out that my discomfort with stating boundaries without explanation revealed how deeply I had internalized the belief that my own needs and limitations required justification, while others' needs and requests did not. She asked me what I feared would happen if I started setting boundaries with my family, and I discovered that my fears were quite specific. I feared they would characterize me as selfish or difficult. I feared they would withdraw even the limited contact and consideration they currently provided. I feared that Vanessa would prevent me from seeing my nieces and nephews, whom I loved despite the complicated dynamics with their mother. I feared my parents would write me out of their will or make clear in some formal way that I was not valued equally with Vanessa. Most fundamentally, I feared confirming what I suspected, but had never wanted to fully acknowledge, which was that their affection for me was conditional and transactional, and could be withdrawn entirely if I stopped performing the role they had assigned me. Dr. Marsh listened to these fears with compassion but without offering false reassurance. She told me that many of these outcomes were indeed possible, and that some of them would probably occur once I started establishing boundaries. She said that the question I needed to answer was whether maintaining access to a relationship that required constant self-sacrifice, and provided minimal genuine connection, was worth the cost to my physical and emotional health. She reminded me that I had nearly died because I had been so focused on managing everyone else's needs and expectations that I had ignored clear signals that my own body was failing. She asked me what I wanted Marcus to learn about how to treat himself and how to allow others to treat him, because he was watching my choices and forming his understanding of what was normal and acceptable in relationships. That question stayed with me through the rest of the week. I watched Marcus navigate his own friendships at school, watched him set small boundaries with peers who wanted to copy his homework or borrow his things without returning them, watched him walk away from a classmate who consistently made fun of his reading choices. He was 9 years old and he already had better boundaries than I did, and I realized that was because I had been careful not to teach him the lessons my family had taught me. I had told him explicitly that he did not need to accept mistreatment to maintain friendships, that real friends respected your limits, that his value was not dependent on how useful he was to others. But I had not been modeling those principles in my own adult relationships, and eventually he would notice the discrepancy between what I told him and what I accepted for myself. The third week after my hospitalization brought the first real test of my emerging clarity. Vanessa called on a Tuesday evening, while I was helping Marcus with his homework. She did not ask how I was feeling or reference my recent cardiac emergency. Instead, she launched immediately into an explanation of a problem she needed me to solve. Her regular babysitter had quit without notice, and she had a work event that evening that she absolutely could not miss. She needed me to come to her house right away and watch her 3 children, ages 7, 5, and 3, for approximately 4 hours. Her tone assumed agreement, and she was already providing details about bedtime routines and where she had left snacks before I had said anything in response. I felt the familiar pull of automatic compliance, the ingrained response pattern that had been shaped over decades. But I also felt something new, a clarity that came from finally seeing the pattern for what it was. I interrupted Vanessa mid-sentence and told her that I was not available to babysit that evening. There was a brief silence, and then she asked why not, with a tone that suggested that my reasons would need to be very compelling to justify this refusal. I remembered Dr. Marsh's coaching about not providing detailed justifications that could be argued with or dismissed. I simply repeated that I was not available, and that she would need to make other arrangements. Vanessa's response was immediate and predictable. She told me I was being incredibly selfish, that family helped each other, that she had always been there for me when I needed her. This last claim was so demonstrably false that I almost laughed. I asked her specifically when she had been there for me, and she could not provide examples. She pivoted to anger, telling me that I was still holding a grudge about her not coming to the hospital, that I was being petty and vindictive, that she had explained that she could not just drop everything for my drama. I told her that my cardiac emergency was not drama, and that her characterization of it as such was part of the reason I was establishing boundaries. I told her I hoped she found childcare for the evening, and that I needed to go help Marcus with his homework. I ended the call before she could respond, and my hands were shaking as I set down the phone. Marcus looked up from his math worksheet and asked if I was okay. I told him I was, that sometimes grown-ups have difficult conversations, but that I had said what I needed to say. He nodded and went back to his homework, accepting this explanation with the resilience of children who are growing up in complicated family systems. I sat at the kitchen table feeling the adrenaline of confrontation, mixed with something that felt startlingly like liberation. Vanessa called back 10 minutes later and I let it go to voicemail. She called 3 more times over the next hour, each call going to voicemail. I did not listen to the messages until Marcus was in bed, and when I finally played them I heard an escalating pattern of anger and manipulation. The first message was sarcastic, suggesting that I must be very busy with my extremely important life. The second was aggressive, telling me that I had always been difficult and jealous, and that she was done trying to maintain a relationship with someone who refused to be a team player. The third was manipulative, suddenly softening into sadness and confusion about why I was being so cold, and whether something was wrong that we needed to talk about. The fourth did not come that evening but arrived the next morning, and it was from my mother. My mother's voicemail began with a disappointed tone that I recognized from childhood, the particular way she communicated that I had failed to meet expectations without stating explicitly what those expectations were. She said that Vanessa had called her very upset about my refusal to help with childcare, and that she was worried about me. She used the language of concern, but the content was clearly criticism. She suggested that I was not handling the stress of my medical situation well, that I seemed to be pushing away the people who cared about me, that family was supposed to support each other through difficult times. She mentioned that Vanessa had been there for me in so many ways over the years, and that it was hurtful for me to refuse such a simple request for help. I listened to the message twice, analyzing the specific language and framing. My mother had taken Vanessa's version of events at face value without calling me to ask for my perspective. She had characterized Vanessa as someone who had been there for me in many ways without apparently noticing that Vanessa had not been there for me during my actual medical emergency just weeks earlier. She had framed my boundary as a failure to support family, while ignoring the years of support I had provided without reciprocity. The message was a masterclass in manipulation, using the language of care and concern to enforce compliance with family expectations that benefited everyone except me. I did not call my mother back. Instead, I documented the entire sequence in my therapy journal, noting the specific timeline of events and the emotional manipulation embedded in each communication. At my next therapy session, Dr. Marsh and I reviewed the documentation together. She pointed out several things I had not consciously registered. She noted that Vanessa had not actually asked for help but had rather assumed it and begun providing instructions, which suggested that my availability was not a question but an assumption. She highlighted my mother's failure to contact me for my perspective before calling to criticize my behavior, which revealed whose version of events was considered authoritative in the family system. She emphasized the pattern of my needs being characterized as drama, while Vanessa's needs were characterized as legitimate crises requiring immediate family mobilization. Dr. Marsh asked me how I felt about the interaction, And I told her the truth, which was that I felt guilty and anxious and angry all at once. I felt guilty for refusing to help even though intellectually I understood that the request had been unreasonable, and that I had been entitled to decline. I felt anxious about the consequences of this boundary, worried about being further marginalized in a family where I already occupied a peripheral position. But underneath those familiar feelings was something newer and more solid, which was anger. I was angry that my medical emergency had been dismissed as drama. I was angry that decades of one-sided support had been forgotten the moment I said no to a single request. I was angry that my mother had called to enforce Vanessa's expectations rather than to ask how I was managing my cardiac condition. Dr. Marsh validated the anger and told me it was appropriate and healthy, that anger was often the emotion that gave people the energy to establish and maintain boundaries with people who violated them. She said that women in particular were socialized to experience guilt around anger, and to suppress it in favor of more acceptable emotions like sadness or anxiety. She told me that my anger was information, that it was telling me something important about violated boundaries and unmet needs, and that learning to tolerate and honor that anger rather than immediately trying to eliminate it would be essential to my recovery both physically and emotionally. We spent the remainder of that session developing what Dr. Marsh called a response protocol for future boundary violations. She helped me draft template responses for common scenarios, including unsolicited advice about my health or parenting, last-minute requests for assistance, criticism disguised as concern, and attempts to leverage guilt or obligation to secure compliance. The templates were deliberately brief and non-defensive, stating my position without providing justification or engaging with the emotional manipulation. We practiced my delivery until I could say these statements without my voice shaking or automatically adding apologies. The next boundary violation came less than a week later. My father called on Sunday morning, which was unusual enough that I answered despite my new caution about family communications. He did not ask about my health or Marcus. Instead, he told me that he and my mother were disappointed in how I was treating Vanessa, that they had raised me better than to be selfish and vindictive, that family was supposed to be more important than whatever grudges I was holding. He told me that I needed to apologize to Vanessa and make things right, and that he expected me to do so before the upcoming family dinner for his birthday. I felt the old familiar pull to explain and justify, to make him understand why I had set the boundary, to convince him that I was not being unreasonable. But I recognized this as the trap it was. My father was not calling to understand my perspective. He was calling to enforce compliance with family expectations, and any explanation I provided would simply be argued with or dismissed. I used one of the templates Dr. Marsh and I had practiced. I told my father that I understood he was disappointed, but that I had made my decision and would not be discussing it further. I told him I would not be attending the birthday dinner because I needed to prioritize my health and recovery. The silence on the other end of the phone was profound. My father was not accustomed to being declined or having his expectations questioned. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted from disappointed to angry. He told me that if I did not attend the dinner and apologize to Vanessa, there would be consequences. He did not specify what those consequences would be, allowing the threat to remain vague and therefore more anxiety-producing. I felt my heart rate increase and had to consciously slow my breathing, aware that stress was literally dangerous for my cardiac condition. I told my father that I hoped he had a nice birthday celebration, and that I needed to end the call. I disconnected before he could respond. Marcus had been in his room playing during this call, but when I emerged from my bedroom where I had taken the conversation for privacy, he was sitting in the hallway looking worried. He asked if I was fighting with Grandpa, and I had to decide in that moment how much truth to share with a 9-year-old about the dysfunction in his extended family. I sat down beside him and told him that sometimes grown-ups disagreed about important things, that I was making choices to take care of myself and him, and that those choices meant some relationships would be different than they had been before. He asked if we would still see Grandma and Grandpa, and I told him honestly that I did not know, that some things were still being figured out. He was quiet for a moment and then said something that surprised me. He told me that he did not like going to their house very much anyway, that Grandma always seemed annoyed when he was there and that Grandpa mostly ignored him. He said that Aunt Vanessa's kids were mean to him, and that nobody ever noticed or did anything about it. He said he felt more comfortable at Miss Claire's house during the one night he had spent there than he ever had at his grandparents' house. His observations were delivered matter-of-factly, without apparent emotional distress, as if he had long ago accepted these realities and was simply reporting them. But hearing him articulate what I had been protecting him from, or thought I had been protecting him from, made clear that he had been aware all along of the family dynamics I had tried to shield him from experiencing directly. I asked him why he had never told me this before, and he looked at me with an expression far too knowing for a 9-year-old. He said that I always seemed stressed after we saw them, and that he did not want to make it worse. He said he knew I was trying to make everyone happy, and that if he complained it would just be another problem I had to solve. I felt something crack in my chest that had nothing to do with my cardiac condition. My son had been managing my emotions and protecting me from additional stress for who knew how long, and in doing so he had learned the same patterns I was trying to unlearn. He was already becoming the family problem solver, the one who minimized his own needs to maintain peace, and I had taught him that through my own example even as I tried to teach him something different with my words. I pulled him close and told him something I should have said much earlier. I told him that it was not his job to manage my feelings or protect me from problems. I told him that I was the parent and he was the child and that those roles were not reversible. I told him that if people made him uncomfortable or treated him badly, I wanted to know about it, and that his honesty would never be an additional burden but rather important information I needed to make good decisions. I told him that we were going to be making some changes in our family relationships, and that some of those changes might feel strange or sad, but that they were necessary to keep both of us healthy and safe. He asked whether we were still a family if we did not see Grandma and Grandpa and Aunt Vanessa very much, and I told him that family was not just about who you were related to but about who showed up for you when things were hard, who treated you with respect and care, who made you feel safe and valued. I told him that Miss Claire had acted more like family in one emergency than his biological grandparents had acted in his entire life, and that we were going to focus our time and energy on people who demonstrated through their actions that they cared about us. He seemed to consider this carefully and then nodded, apparently satisfied with this redefinition. That evening after Marcus was asleep, I sat down and drafted an email to my parents and Vanessa. Dr. Marsh and I had discussed the possibility of written communication rather than phone calls for establishing major boundaries, because written communication eliminated the possibility of being talked over or having your words reinterpreted, and it provided documentation of exactly what was said. The email took me 3 hours to write, going through multiple drafts as I worked to achieve the right balance of clarity and restraint. The final version was relatively brief. I acknowledged that we had different perspectives on recent events, and that those differences had revealed fundamental incompatibilities in our understanding of family relationships. I stated clearly that I would not be attending future family gatherings for the foreseeable future, that I needed to prioritize my cardiac recovery, which required minimizing stress and surrounding myself with supportive relationships. I acknowledged that this decision would likely be disappointing to them, but emphasized that it was not negotiable, and that I was not seeking their approval or understanding. I addressed specifically the incident of my hospitalization, stating factually that I had experienced a cardiac emergency, that they had been notified and asked to come to the hospital or provide care for Marcus, and that they had declined to do either. I noted that this response had provided me with complete information about how I was valued in the family system, and that I was acting accordingly by establishing boundaries that protected my well-being. I made clear that I was not interested in explanations or justifications for their choices, that I was simply making different choices for myself going forward based on demonstrated patterns rather than hoped for changes. I ended the email by stating that I would be limiting contact to essential communications only, that I would not be available for last-minute requests or assumed obligations, and that any future relationship would need to be built on mutual respect and demonstrated care rather than on my continued acceptance of unequal treatment. I included my therapist's name and contact information in case they wanted professional guidance in understanding my perspective, though I did not expect them to pursue that option. I read the email through one final time, attached the documentation I had been keeping of our recent interactions, and sent it before I could second-guess the decision. The response was swift and exactly what I had anticipated. Within an hour I received separate emails from my mother, my father, and Vanessa. My mother's email was long and rambling, alternating between hurt and anger. She claimed not to understand where this was coming from, suggested that I was not thinking clearly due to my medical issues, and insisted that I was remembering events incorrectly. She characterized my boundary setting as a personal attack and claimed that she had always done her best for both of her daughters. She ended with an ultimatum disguised as concern, stating that if I continued down this path I would end up alone and would eventually regret pushing away the people who loved me. My father's email was shorter and angrier. He told me that I was being disrespectful and ungrateful, that I had no right to make accusations against my family, and that I was clearly being influenced by my therapist who was probably filling my head with ideas about victimhood and blame. He stated that he would not tolerate being spoken to this way, and that I needed to retract my statements and apologize, or accept the consequences of being estranged from the family. He made clear that the choice was mine and that I should think very carefully about what I was throwing away. Vanessa's email was the most revealing. She expressed no concern for my health or well-being. Instead, she focused entirely on how my boundaries were affecting her, characterizing my refusal to provide childcare as a hostile act that had caused her significant inconvenience and stress. She accused me of jealousy, claiming that I had always resented her for being more successful and having a complete family. She stated that she was done trying to maintain a relationship with someone who was so clearly bitter and difficult, and that she would be telling her children that their aunt was not available because I had chosen to isolate myself from the family. She ended with a threat disguised as a prediction, suggesting that when I eventually needed help, I should not expect anyone to be there for me since I had made clear that I did not value family. I read all 3 emails once and then saved them in a folder with the rest of my documentation. I did not respond to any of them. Dr. Marsh had warned me that the initial response to clear boundaries from people who were accustomed to unlimited access would be intense and manipulative, designed to create enough guilt and anxiety to restore the previous dynamic. She had advised me that the most powerful response to such manipulation was silence, allowing their words to stand without rebuttal or engagement. The temptation to defend myself was strong, but I recognized that defense implied that their accusations had validity requiring refutation, and I was no longer operating from that premise. Over the next 2 weeks I received multiple additional attempts at contact. My mother called and left voicemails alternating between anger and pleading. My father sent a series of text messages telling me I was making a terrible mistake. Vanessa posted vague messages on social media about family betrayal and people who abandoned you when you needed them most, clearly designed for me to see. Each of these attempts was documented and saved but not responded to. I had said what I needed to say, and I had been clear that I was not interested in negotiation or explanation. Their continued attempts to engage were about their needs, not mine, and I was no longer responsible for managing their emotional responses to my boundaries. The silence I maintained externally was not reflective of my internal state. I struggled with guilt and doubt and the persistent fear that I was overreacting or being unnecessarily harsh. I questioned whether I should have given them more chances, whether I was punishing them disproportionately for failures that were perhaps unintentional, whether I was modeling good conflict resolution for Marcus by establishing such firm boundaries rather than working through our differences. These doubts were persistent and consuming, occupying far more mental space than I wanted to give them. Dr. Marsh helped me recognize that these doubts were the result of decades of conditioning, that my family had taught me that my perceptions were unreliable, and that my needs were less important than maintaining family cohesion at any cost. She helped me return repeatedly to the documented facts rather than my internalized beliefs about what I should feel or do. The facts were clear and undeniable. I had experienced a medical emergency. They had been notified. They had not come. They had not provided care for my child. They had not followed up to check on my condition. When I had established boundaries in response to this abandonment, they had characterized those boundaries as attacks rather than self-protection. These facts required no interpretation or justification. They were simply what had occurred. By the end of the first month after my hospitalization, a new pattern had emerged. My family had moved from active attempts to restore contact to what appeared to be a collective decision to respect my stated boundaries, though not in the way I had intended. Rather than engaging in any self-reflection or attempting to understand my perspective, they had apparently concluded that I was the problem and had moved forward without me. I discovered this through my Aunt Laura, my mother's younger sister who had always occupied a somewhat marginal position in the family herself, and who had reached out after hearing about my hospitalization. Aunt Laura called me on a Saturday afternoon and asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed somewhat hesitantly, uncertain whether this was an attempt at family mediation that I was not interested in participating in. But when we met at a cafe in Mesa, Laura surprised me by immediately apologizing for not knowing what had happened sooner. She explained that she had been traveling for work and had only learned about my hospitalization when she returned home and called my mother to catch up. When she had asked how I was recovering, my mother had dismissed the question and changed the subject. Laura had been surprised enough by this response that she had called my father directly, and he had told her that I had had some minor health issues but was fine now and that I was going through a difficult phase where I was not speaking to the family. Laura had then done what no one else in my family had done, which was to call me directly and ask what had actually happened. I told her the full story, including the diagnosis, the hospital stay, Marcus being cared for by someone I had never met in person because no family members would help, and the subsequent boundary setting that had led to complete estrangement. Laura listened with increasing shock and anger, and when I finished she told me something that helped place the final piece of the pattern into clear view. She explained that my mother and her had grown up in a family with similar dynamics, where their mother had clearly favored their older sister, while treating my mother and Laura as secondary priorities. Laura had moved across the country in her 20s specifically to escape that dynamic, and had maintained only minimal contact with her family of origin. My mother had stayed and had spent her entire adult life trying to earn their mother's approval and equal treatment, never quite managing to achieve it. Laura told me that she had watched my mother replicate the exact same pattern with Vanessa and me, apparently unable to recognize that she was inflicting on her own children the same pain she had experienced and still carried. This information reframed everything. My mother's treatment of me was not personal rejection but rather the unconscious perpetuation of her own trauma. She had identified Vanessa with the favored sister and had identified me with herself, and she had played out the same script she had learned in childhood without apparent awareness that she was doing so. This understanding did not excuse the behavior or eliminate the harm it had caused, but it did provide context that made the situation feel less like a reflection of my inadequacy and more like a systemic dysfunction that predated my existence. Laura asked what she could do to help, and I found myself without a clear answer. The damage was done and the boundaries were set, and I did not want or need my family to understand or approve of my choices. But having one family member validate my experience and confirm that my perceptions were accurate, rather than distorted, felt significant. Laura told me she would remain in contact with me regardless of what the rest of the family did, and she asked if she could occasionally visit with Marcus since he was her nephew and she wanted to maintain that relationship. I agreed, recognizing that Laura represented a different possibility for what family could be, and that Marcus deserved to know that not all relatives were sources of stress and disappointment. The medical follow-up appointments showed that my cardiac function was improving steadily with medication and reduced stress. Dr. Kwan was pleased with my progress and told me that patients who made significant lifestyle changes, including addressing toxic relationships, typically had better long-term outcomes than those who returned to the same stress patterns that had contributed to their conditions. She asked about my family situation directly, and I told her honestly that I was no longer in contact with my parents or sister. She nodded without surprise and told me that in her experience, major health crises often clarified relationship patterns that had previously been tolerable, and that many patients found themselves making significant changes to their social networks as part of their recovery. The space that opened up in my life from not managing my family's needs and emotions was substantial and disorienting. I had not realized how much time and energy I had been spending on anticipating their needs, responding to their requests, managing their reactions, and recovering from their casual cruelty disguised as normal family interaction. Without that constant background drain, I found I had capacity for things I had not prioritized in years. I started reading fiction again. I established a regular sleep schedule. I cooked actual meals instead of surviving on convenience food. I noticed that my baseline anxiety level had decreased substantially, that I moved through my days without the constant low-level dread of the next family demand or criticism. Marcus also seemed lighter, less worried. His teacher mentioned during a parent conference that he seemed more relaxed in class and was participating more actively in group activities. When I asked him about it, he said he liked that I was not always on my phone dealing with family drama and that I seemed happier. His observation was accurate. I was happier despite everything, or perhaps because of everything. The cost of maintaining relationships with people who did not value me had been higher than I had allowed myself to acknowledge, and paying that cost had been depleting resources I needed for myself and my son. The first holiday season without family contact approached, and I felt anxiety about how to handle Thanksgiving and Christmas without the traditional gatherings that had always anchored these occasions regardless of how stressful they had been. Marcus asked what we would be doing for Thanksgiving, and I told him honestly that I was not sure but that we would figure it out together. He suggested with surprising enthusiasm that we invite Miss Claire, since she had helped us and maybe she did not have family nearby. I realized that I had never asked Claire about her personal situation beyond the basic information she had shared about being widowed and raising children alone. I called Claire and asked if she had Thanksgiving plans, feeling awkward about extending what might seem like an obligatory invitation. She laughed and told me that she had been planning to eat takeout and watch movies, which was her usual practice for holidays since her adult children lived in other states and had their own family obligations. She accepted my invitation immediately and asked what she could bring, and we settled into planning a small Thanksgiving dinner for the three of us that felt more genuine than any holiday gathering I could remember attending. Thanksgiving itself was surprisingly lovely. Claire arrived with homemade pies and stories about her children when they were young. Marcus helped with cooking and setting the table, more engaged than I had seen him during previous holiday preparations. We ate dinner without any undercurrent of tension or criticism, without anyone making passive-aggressive comments or comparing our meal unfavorably to some imagined standard. After dinner we played board games and watched a movie, and when Claire left that evening Marcus told me it was the best Thanksgiving he could remember. I realized it was the best Thanksgiving I could remember too, and that the absence of family had not diminished the occasion but rather had allowed space for actual connection and enjoyment. The following week I received a letter from my parents' attorney. The letter informed me that my parents were filing for grandparent visitation rights to Marcus, claiming that I was denying them access to their grandson without justification, and that this denial was harmful to Marcus's well-being. The letter outlined Arizona's grandparent visitation statutes and asserted that my parents had standing to petition the court for court-ordered visitation. Reading the letter felt like being punched in the chest, the casual cruelty of using legal systems to punish someone for establishing boundaries after they had failed to provide basic support during a medical emergency. I called Dr. Marsh immediately, and she helped me move from panic to strategic thinking. She recommended a family law attorney named Jennifer Oakes who had experience with grandparent rights cases. I met with Jennifer the following day, bringing all of my documentation including the hospital records, the emails, the therapy notes, and the timeline of events. Jennifer reviewed everything carefully, and then told me something that provided immense relief. She explained that Arizona's grandparent visitation statute had very specific requirements, including that the grandparents had to demonstrate a substantial pre-existing relationship with the child, and that denial of visitation would cause the child significant harm. Jennifer told me that based on my documentation, my parents would have difficulty meeting either requirement. The evidence showed that they had been minimally involved in Marcus's life even before I established boundaries, that they had failed to respond during my medical emergency when Marcus needed care, and that Marcus himself had expressed relief at not having to attend uncomfortable family gatherings. Jennifer recommended that we respond to their petition with a comprehensive filing that included all of this evidence, that we request the case be dismissed based on their failure to establish standing, and that we be prepared to have Marcus interviewed by a court-appointed evaluator if necessary. The process of preparing our response required me to document in legal format what I had been processing in therapy, creating a formal record of decades of dysfunction and recent abandonment. Jennifer worked with me to present the information in a way that was factual and unemotional, focusing on observable behaviors and documented events, rather than subjective interpretations. We included statements from Dr. Marsh about the impact of family stress on my cardiac condition, medical records from my hospitalization showing that my parents had been contacted and had declined to help, and school records showing that Marcus had improved academically and socially since we had established boundaries with extended family. The legal process unfolded over the next several months, and through it all I maintained the boundaries I had established. My parents' attorney made multiple attempts to portray me as unstable or vindictive, but the documentary evidence told a different story. It showed a mother who had nearly died while trying to maintain relationships with family members who consistently devalued her, who had made the difficult decision to prioritize her health and her child's well-being over dysfunctional family loyalty, and who had responded to abandonment during a medical crisis by establishing appropriate protective boundaries. When Marcus was interviewed by the court-appointed evaluator, he spoke with the same matter-of-fact clarity he had demonstrated at home, explaining that he felt safer and happier since we had stopped attending family gatherings, and that he did not want to be forced to spend time with grandparents who had not visited him in the hospital when his mom was sick. The judge dismissed the petition for grandparent visitation, finding that my parents had failed to establish the required substantial pre-existing relationship, and that the evidence suggested that court-ordered visitation would likely cause harm rather than prevent it. The ruling was definitive and final, establishing legal protection for the boundaries I had set and confirming through official channels what I had come to understand through painful experience. My family's claims about caring for me and Marcus were not supported by their actual behavior, and a neutral third party examining the evidence had reached the same conclusion I had reached through lived experience. The weeks following my return home from the hospital brought a clarity that felt both liberating and terrifying. I had established basic boundaries during that phone call with my mother when I said the single word "noted" in response to her cheerful reminder about Vanessa's birthday dinner, but I had not yet fully articulated to myself what those boundaries would mean in practical terms or how I would maintain them when the inevitable pressure came. Dr. Marsh had warned me during our second session that people who are accustomed to unlimited access to your time, energy, and resources will not accept boundaries gracefully, that they would interpret limits as attacks and would mobilize various strategies to restore the previous dynamic. The first real test of my emerging boundary system came approximately 3 weeks after my hospitalization. I was working at my desk in the small home office I had set up in what had originally been intended as a dining room, transcribing medical records with the focused concentration that the work required. Marcus was at school, the house was quiet, and I was managing to maintain productivity despite the ongoing fatigue that my cardiologist had warned me would take months to fully resolve. My phone rang with a number I did not immediately recognize, though something about the area code registered as familiar. I answered cautiously, and my sister Vanessa's voice came through with a tone that mixed irritation with assumed authority. She did not ask how I was feeling or reference my recent cardiac emergency. Instead, she launched immediately into an explanation of why she was calling from an unfamiliar number, something about her regular phone being broken, and using a friend's device. This explanation felt unnecessary and suspicious, as if she were preemptively justifying why I might not have recognized the number and therefore might not have answered if I had known it was her. She then moved directly into the purpose of her call, which was to inform me that she needed me to pick up her 3 children from school that afternoon and keep them at my house until approximately 8 in the evening when she would be finished with what she described vaguely as an important appointment. The request was presented not as a question but as an expectation, with details about the school pickup procedures and the children's after-school snack preferences provided before I had agreed to help. I listened to her monologue with a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing the interaction from outside myself. I recognized all the familiar patterns in her communication style, including the assumption of my availability, the lack of advance notice, the absence of any acknowledgement that this might be an imposition, and the strategic vagueness about why she needed help that would make it difficult for me to determine whether this was truly an emergency or simply a convenience. When Vanessa finally paused in her instructions, I interrupted her to say that I was not available to provide childcare that afternoon. The words felt foreign in my mouth, unfamiliar and slightly dangerous, as if I were speaking a language I had only recently learned and was not yet fluent in. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that occurs when someone hears something so unexpected that they need a moment to process whether they understood correctly. Then Vanessa asked me to repeat what I had said, her tone shifting from instructional to confused. I repeated that I was not available to help with childcare that afternoon, and I added that in the future I would need at least a week's advance notice for any childcare requests and that I could not guarantee availability even with advance notice given my current health situation and work obligations. This additional boundary about advance notice had not been something I planned to articulate, but it emerged in the moment as I recognized that simply declining this one request would not be sufficient to change the pattern. Vanessa needed to understand that the entire system of assumed availability was ending, not just this particular instance. Vanessa's response was immediate and predictable in its structure, even though the specific words were new. She told me I was being unreasonable and selfish, that family helped each other without requiring advance notice and formal requests, that she had always been available when I needed her. This last claim was so demonstrably false that I felt something shift inside me, a kind of internal decision point where I could either let the falsehood stand unchallenged as I always had before, or I could name it directly and accept the consequences of that honesty. I asked Vanessa to provide specific examples of times when she had been available to help me when I needed it. She became flustered and angry, telling me that she should not have to justify herself to me, that the fact that I was even asking such a question proved that I was being deliberately difficult. I waded through her anger without responding, a technique that Dr. Marsh and I had practiced where I simply allowed the other person's emotional reaction to exist without trying to manage it or defend against it. The silence that followed Vanessa's outburst was uncomfortable but instructive, revealing that she had no actual examples to provide, and that her claim of reciprocal support had been a convenient fiction rather than a description of reality. I told Vanessa that I hoped she found childcare for the afternoon, and that I needed to return to work. She tried to continue the conversation, shifting tactics from anger to pleading, telling me that she had no other options and that I was putting her in an impossible situation. I recognized this as another familiar pattern, the way she had always framed her poor planning or unreasonable expectations as crises that I was responsible for solving. I repeated that I was not available and that I needed to end the call. I disconnected before she could respond, and I sat at my desk with my heart racing and my hands shaking from the adrenaline of confrontation. The immediate aftermath of that call brought a cascade of additional contact attempts. Vanessa called back 3 times in succession, and I sent each call to voicemail without listening to the messages. Approximately 20 minutes later, my mother called. I considered not answering, but I was curious about how quickly Vanessa had mobilized my mother to intervene and what form that intervention would take. My mother's voice when I answered was concerned and slightly confused, the tone of someone who had been given information that did not quite make sense but that they were prepared to believe based on the source. My mother explained that Vanessa had called her very upset, saying that she had asked me for a small favor, and that I had been hostile and unreasonable in refusing to help. My mother said that Vanessa was worried about me, that my behavior seemed very unlike my usual self, and that perhaps the stress of my recent health issues was affecting my judgment and emotional stability. The framing was masterful in its manipulation, positioning Vanessa as the concerned party and me as someone whose perceptions and choices were suspect due to medical or mental health issues. It was a strategy one recognized from childhood. The way my parents had always been willing to believe that I was being unreasonable or oversensitive, rather than considering that Vanessa's version of events might be incomplete or inaccurate. I asked my mother whether Vanessa had mentioned that her request had been for same-day childcare with no advance notice, or whether she had acknowledged that I was still recovering from a cardiac emergency that had occurred less than a month earlier. My mother's silence suggested that these details had not been included in Vanessa's account. I explained the actual nature of the request and my response, and I pointed out that asking for reasonable advance notice for childcare was not hostile or unreasonable behavior, but rather a basic boundary that any rational person would understand. My mother's response was revealing in what it showed about her priorities and her understanding of family relationships. She told me that while she understood I was still recovering, family members should be able to count on each other for help even on short notice, and that Vanessa probably assumed I would be available because I had always been available before. She suggested that my new reluctance to help was concerning, and that I should think carefully about whether I was allowing my health situation to make me bitter or selfish. She reminded me that Vanessa had children and responsibilities that made her life more complicated than mine, and that those of us without such complications had an obligation to be flexible and supportive. The implication that my life was less complicated than Vanessa's simply because I had 1 child instead of 3, or that my single parenthood was somehow easier than her married parenthood, was so absurd that I almost laughed. But beneath the absurdity was the familiar pattern that I was finally seeing with complete clarity. My mother genuinely believed that my needs and limitations were less important than Vanessa's preferences and convenience, that my role in the family was to provide support while Vanessa's role was to receive it, and that any deviation from this assigned role represented a character flaw, rather than appropriate self-protection. I told my mother that I appreciated her concern but that I had made my decision, and that I would not be discussing it further. She tried to continue the conversation, telling me that I was making a mistake, and that I would regret pushing away family members who cared about me. I told her that family members who genuinely cared about me would have come to the hospital when I nearly died, and that their failure to do so had provided me with complete information about the nature of their care and concern. I ended the call before she could respond, and this time I turned off my phone completely to prevent additional contact attempts from disrupting my workday. The silence that followed was both peaceful and anxiety-producing. I had drawn a clear line, had named the pattern explicitly, and had refused to be manipulated back into my assigned role. But I also knew that this was just the beginning of what would likely be an extended campaign to restore the previous dynamic, and I had no illusions that my family would accept these boundaries without escalating their efforts to undermine them. Dr. Marsh had prepared me for this possibility, explaining that the most dangerous time in leaving an abusive or dysfunctional system is often the period immediately after you establish boundaries, when the other parties realize that their usual control mechanisms are no longer working, and they become more aggressive in their attempts to restore their access and authority. The remainder of that week was marked by various contact attempts that I documented carefully in the journal Dr. Marsh had asked me to keep. My father left a voicemail telling me that I needed to call him back immediately to discuss my disrespectful behavior toward my mother and sister. Vanessa sent a series of text messages alternating between anger and manipulation, first telling me that I was a terrible person, and then suggesting that she was worried about my mental health and wanted to help me get the support I needed. My mother sent an email with the subject line "concerned about you" that detailed all the ways my recent behavior was out of character and suggested that I might be experiencing depression or cognitive changes related to my cardiac condition that required professional evaluation. Each of these communications followed predictable patterns and used familiar tactics. The framing of concern that positioned my boundary setting as evidence of dysfunction rather than health. The suggestions that I was not thinking clearly and needed others to make decisions for me. The threats disguised as consequences. The guilt-inducing references to family loyalty and obligation. I documented each contact attempt but did not respond to any of them, following Dr. Marsh's advice that engagement of any kind would simply provide opportunities for further manipulation, and that silence was often the most powerful response to bad faith communication. During my next therapy session, Dr. Marsh and I reviewed the documentation together. She pointed out patterns I had not consciously noticed, including the way my family members were coordinating their responses and reinforcing each other's narratives. My mother's concern about my mental health echoed Vanessa's earlier suggestion that I was not thinking clearly. My father's characterization of my behavior as disrespectful mirrored language Vanessa had used in her text messages. This coordination suggested that they were discussing their approach to me and strategizing about how to most effectively pressure me back into compliance. Dr. Marsh explained that this kind of coordinated response was common when someone tried to leave or establish boundaries within a dysfunctional family system. The system operated to maintain homeostasis, to keep everyone in their assigned roles. And when one person disrupted that balance by refusing to continue performing their assigned function, the other members of the system would work together to restore equilibrium. This restoration effort could take many forms, including emotional manipulation, recruitment of other family members or friends to pressure the boundary setter, threats of consequences, and even formal interventions like wellness checks or legal actions designed to characterize the boundary setter as mentally unstable or unfit. She warned me to be prepared for potential escalation and suggested that I consider what additional protective measures might be necessary if my family continued to refuse to respect my stated boundaries. We discussed the possibility of a formal cease and desist letter if the contact attempts continued after I had clearly communicated my desire for limited contact. We talked about the importance of documenting everything in case legal protections became necessary. We reviewed the signs that might indicate a need to involve law enforcement if my family's behavior crossed the line from manipulation into harassment or stalking. These conversations felt surreal, the idea that I might need legal protection from my own parents and sister seeming like something that happened in other people's families but not in mine. But Dr. Marsh reminded me that my family had already demonstrated their willingness to prioritize their own needs over my well-being in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, and that people who would not come to the hospital during a cardiac emergency were people whose respect for boundaries could not be assumed. She emphasized that hoping my family would suddenly develop respect for my limits was not a strategy, and that I needed to prepare for the reality that they might escalate, rather than accept my clearly stated boundaries. The escalation Dr. Marsh had warned me about came approximately 2 weeks after my refusal to provide childcare for Vanessa. I arrived home from a medical follow-up appointment to find my parents' car parked in front of my house. They were sitting in the vehicle waiting for me, and when I pulled into my driveway they both got out and approached my car before I could get into the house. The ambush quality of this visit was clearly intentional, designed to catch me in a situation where I could not easily avoid engagement, and where the presence of neighbors might pressure me to maintain civility even if the conversation became difficult. My mother spoke first, her tone combining hurt and determination in a way that was obviously calculated to evoke guilt. She told me that they had come because they were very worried about me, that my recent behavior was completely out of character, and that they needed to understand what was really going on so they could help me. My father stood slightly behind her with his arms crossed, his body language conveying judgment and disapproval even before he spoke. I recognized the dynamic from childhood, my mother playing the role of concerned peacemaker, while my father positioned himself as the authority figure whose disappointment was meant to shame me into compliance. I told them that I had asked for space and that showing up at my house unannounced was not respecting that request. My mother acted as if she had not heard me, continuing to talk about her concerns and her desire to help. My father interjected to tell me that I did not get to dictate terms to my parents, that they had every right to check on their daughter when she was clearly going through some kind of crisis, and that my refusal to engage with them was further evidence that something was seriously wrong. The circular logic was perfect in its construction, where my boundary setting was treated as proof that I needed intervention, and any resistance to that intervention was treated as additional proof of dysfunction. I repeated that I was not available for this conversation, and that they needed to leave my property. My mother's expression shifted from concern to hurt, and she asked how I could be so cold to the people who had raised me and who only wanted what was best for me. I felt the familiar pull of guilt, the decades of conditioning that made her pain feel like my responsibility, but I also felt something newer and stronger, which was clarity about the manipulation embedded in her question. People who genuinely wanted what was best for me would have respected my clearly stated need for space. People who had actually raised me with love and care would have come to the hospital when I nearly died. I told them that I would call the police if they did not leave immediately. The threat felt extreme even as I made it, but I recognized that I needed to communicate absolute seriousness about my boundaries, or they would continue to believe that enough pressure would eventually break my resolve. My father's face flushed red with anger, and he told me that I had become a stranger to him, that the daughter he had raised would never speak to her parents this way. I felt a flash of bitter amusement at this claim, because the daughter he had raised had been too conditioned by guilt and the desperate pursuit of approval to ever establish appropriate boundaries, and the fact that I was now doing so was evidence not that I had become a stranger but that I had finally stopped performing the role that had been destroying me. My mother began to cry, and I felt the old familiar response of wanting to comfort her and make her pain stop. But I also recognized that her tears were a tool she had used my entire life to make her emotional state my responsibility, and that allowing myself to be manipulated by those tears now would undo all the progress I had made in establishing boundaries. I turned away from them and walked toward my front door. My father called after me, his voice harsh with anger, telling me that I would regret this decision, that I was throwing away my family over nothing, that I would find myself alone and would eventually come crawling back asking for forgiveness that might not be available. I went inside and locked the door behind me, watching through the window as they stood in my driveway for several more minutes before finally getting back in their car and leaving. My whole body was shaking with adrenaline, and I had to sit down on the floor in my entryway until my heart rate returned to something approaching normal. I was aware that the confrontation had been physically dangerous for me given my cardiac condition, that the stress and adrenaline could have triggered another cardiac event, and that my parents had either not considered this risk or had not cared about it sufficiently to modify their approach. I called Dr. Marsh immediately after they left, and she was able to speak with me briefly between her scheduled appointments. I described what had happened, and she validated my response while also expressing concern about my physical safety if these confrontations continued. She suggested that we consider expediting the cease and desist letter we had discussed, and she provided me with the contact information for Jennifer Oakes, the family law attorney she had mentioned previously. She emphasized that I should not wait for another confrontation to establish formal legal boundaries, that my family had now demonstrated their willingness to ignore my stated limits, and that I needed stronger protections in place. I contacted Jennifer Oakes that afternoon and scheduled a consultation for the following week. In the meantime, I documented the incident in detail, including the specific language my parents had used and their refusal to leave when asked. I checked my home security camera footage and confirmed that I had video evidence of the encounter, including their initial approach and their continued presence on my property after I had asked them to leave. This documentation felt like preparation for something I had never imagined needing protection from, but I recognized that my perception of my family as fundamentally safe despite their emotional dysfunction had been based on outdated assumptions that their recent behavior had definitively disproven. Marcus came home from school that afternoon with no awareness of what had occurred earlier, and I was grateful that the confrontation had happened while he was not present. He told me about his day with the unselfconscious enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who had done well on a math test and had been chosen to help the teacher with a special project. I listened and responded appropriately, but part of my mind remained occupied with the morning's events and with the growing recognition that I was going to need to take more formal steps to protect myself and Marcus from family members who were demonstrating increasing willingness to violate boundaries and ignore clearly stated requests for distance. That evening, after Marcus was in bed, I sat down and drafted a detailed email to my parents and Vanessa. The email drew on templates that Dr. Marsh had helped me develop, but was adapted to my specific situation. I stated clearly that I was requesting no contact except for genuine emergencies, which I defined specifically to exclude matters of convenience, social events, or anything that could be handled through written communication. I explained that unannounced visits to my home were not acceptable and would be treated as trespassing if they continued. I emphasized that my boundaries were not negotiable and were not a topic for discussion or debate. I addressed directly the concerns they had raised about my mental health and decision-making capacity, stating that I was under the care of both a cardiologist and a therapist, that both professionals supported my boundary setting as appropriate and healthy, and that I would be happy to have them contact my providers directly if they had genuine concerns about my well-being, rather than simply using those concerns as justification for violating my stated boundaries. I included the contact information for both Dr. Kwan and Dr. Marsh, knowing that neither would confirm or deny that I was a patient, but that the offer itself would demonstrate that I was not isolated or making decisions without professional input. I ended the email by stating that continued violation of my boundaries would result in formal legal action, including restraining orders if necessary, and that I hoped such measures would not be required, but that I was prepared to pursue them if my clearly stated limits continued to be ignored. I attached the video footage from my home security camera showing their presence on my property after I had asked them to leave, making clear that I had documentation of boundary violations and was prepared to use that documentation if needed. I read the email through multiple times, adjusting language to ensure it was clear and factual rather than emotional, and then I sent it before I could second-guess the decision. The response came within hours, though not in the form I expected. Rather than replying directly to my email, my parents sent a message to Claire, my supervisor who had helped with Marcus during my hospitalization. They had apparently obtained her contact information from somewhere, possibly from Marcus during the overnight stay, and they were attempting to recruit her to their narrative about my supposed mental health crisis. The message expressed their concern that I was isolating myself and making poor decisions, suggested that my cardiac condition might be affecting my cognitive function, and asked whether Claire had noticed any troubling changes in my behavior or judgment. Claire forwarded me the message immediately and called to ask what was going on. I explained the situation, including my hospitalization, my family's failure to respond, and their current efforts to undermine my boundaries by characterizing my self-protection as mental illness. Claire listened carefully, and then told me something that was both validating and infuriating. She said that my parents' message had actually backfired badly, because it had demonstrated exactly the kind of manipulation and boundary violation that would cause someone to establish distance from their family. She told me that she had responded to them with a brief message stating that she had no concerns about my judgment or capability, that I had handled a difficult situation with remarkable competence, and that she would not be discussing my personal matters with them further. Claire's support meant more than I could easily articulate. She had no obligation to involve herself in my family drama, or to risk potential conflict with my parents by refusing to participate in their narrative. But she had immediately recognized the manipulation in their approach, and had shut it down clearly without being drawn into extended engagement. Her response demonstrated what healthy boundary setting looked like, and it provided me with a model for how to handle similar attempts if my family tried to recruit other people to pressure me into restoring contact. The consultation with Jennifer Oakes the following week was thorough and professionally reassuring. I brought all of my documentation, including the emails, the voicemails, the text messages, the video footage, and the timeline I had been maintaining of all contact attempts and boundary violations. Jennifer reviewed everything carefully and told me that I had an extremely strong case for a restraining order if I chose to pursue one, but that she recommended starting with a formal cease and desist letter to establish a clear paper trail before taking court action. She explained that having an attorney send the letter rather than sending it myself added weight and formality that often motivated compliance, even from people who had ignored previous direct requests. Jennifer drafted a letter that was precise in its legal language, while remaining clear enough that my parents would understand exactly what was being communicated. The letter documented the pattern of contact attempts after I had clearly stated my desire for limited communication, detailed the unannounced visit to my property after I had asked them to leave, referenced my cardiac condition and the medical necessity of reducing stress, and stated explicitly that any future contact except for genuine emergencies would be considered harassment and would result in legal action including restraining orders and potentially civil suits for intentional infliction of emotional distress. The letter was sent via certified mail to ensure documentation of receipt, and copies were retained for our files in case future legal action became necessary. Jennifer told me that most people respond to cease and desist letters with compliance because they suddenly realize that their behavior is being taken seriously and that there will be real consequences for continued violations. However, she also warned me that some people respond with increased hostility and escalation, viewing the letter as an attack that requires retaliation. She advised me to be particularly vigilant in the days immediately following their receipt of the letter, and to contact her immediately if any concerning behavior occurred. The cease and desist letters were received by my parents and Vanessa within 3 days of being sent, and the confirmation of receipt arrived at Jennifer's office through the certified mail system. I waited to see what response the letters would generate, prepared for either compliance or escalation, but hoping that the formality of legal involvement would finally communicate the seriousness of my boundaries in a way that my direct statements had apparently failed to convey. The waiting period was anxiety-producing, and I found myself hypervigilant about any unusual cars in my neighborhood or any indication that my family might be attempting to circumvent the established boundaries. The response came not from my parents directly but rather through the legal system itself, in a form I had not fully anticipated despite Jennifer's warnings about possible escalation. Approximately 2 weeks after my parents received the cease and desist letter, I was served with paperwork indicating that they had filed a petition for grandparent visitation rights to Marcus. The petition characterized me as an unfit parent who was denying them access to their grandson based on irrational anger about perceived slights, and it requested that the court order regular visitation including overnight stays to preserve their relationship with Marcus and to protect him from my supposedly unstable emotional state. Reading the petition felt like being physically struck. My parents were using the legal system not just to attempt to force contact but to characterize me as an unfit mother, to claim that my protection of Marcus from their dysfunction was actually harm to him, and to seek court-ordered access that would give them power over my parenting decisions and my ability to maintain boundaries. The strategic cruelty of this approach was breathtaking, and I recognized it as an escalation that revealed exactly how far they were willing to go to punish me for refusing to continue accepting their treatment and performing my assigned role in the family system. The dismissal of my parents' legal petition should have brought closure, but instead it seemed to activate something more aggressive in their approach to the situation. Within a week of the court ruling, I began noticing a pattern of what could only be described as a coordinated campaign to undermine my credibility and isolate me further from extended family and community connections. The first indication came through social media, where Vanessa had begun posting carefully crafted narratives about family betrayal and mental instability, never mentioning me by name but including enough identifying details that anyone who knew our family would understand exactly who she was referencing. These posts described a family member who had cut off all contact without explanation, who had refused to allow loving grandparents access to their grandchild, who was clearly suffering from some kind of breakdown but refused to accept help or acknowledge reality. The posts were written in a tone of sorrowful concern rather than anger, which made them more effective as manipulation. Friends and acquaintances who did not know the full story began reaching out to me with messages expressing concern, asking if I was okay, suggesting that maybe I should reconsider my position before I did permanent damage to important relationships. Each message required emotional energy to navigate, forcing me to decide whether to explain the full situation or simply accept being mischaracterized. I brought this development to my therapy session with Dr. Marsh, feeling both angry and helpless about the situation. She listened carefully and then asked me a question that reframed my thinking about the entire dynamic. She asked whether I was surprised that people who had failed to show up during my medical emergency were now working hard to control the narrative about why we were no longer in contact. When I considered the question honestly, I realized I was not surprised at all. People who genuinely cared about relationship repair would have started with self-reflection and apology, not with legal action and public relations campaigns. The fact that my family had immediately moved to coercive and manipulative tactics, rather than addressing the actual issues between us, was simply additional confirmation that I had made the right decision in establishing boundaries. Dr. Marsh suggested that I consider making one clear public statement about my situation, not to justify my choices or convince anyone of anything, but simply to establish my own version of events for anyone who might be interested in hearing it. She emphasized that this statement should be factual rather than emotional, should focus on observable events rather than interpretations, and should be offered without expectation that it would change minds or repair relationships. The purpose would be to ensure that my perspective existed in the record, so that in future years when Marcus or others looked back at this period, they would have access to information beyond the narrative my family was constructing. I spent several days considering whether to make such a statement and what form it should take. I ultimately decided to write a single detailed post on my own social media accounts, which I rarely used but which were connected to various extended family members, old friends, and community acquaintances who had been receiving Vanessa's version of events. The post took me hours to write, going through multiple drafts as I worked to maintain the factual tone Dr. Marsh had recommended while still conveying the essential truth of what had occurred. The final version began by acknowledging that there had been questions about my estrangement from my immediate family, and that I wanted to provide clarity about the situation. I explained that I had experienced a cardiac emergency at my son's school play, had been hospitalized with heart failure, and that when the hospital had contacted my parents and sister to request help with my son's care, they had declined to come to the hospital or provide assistance. I stated that this response had provided me with clear information about how I was valued within the family system, and that I had made the decision to establish boundaries that protected my health and my son's well-being. I addressed the grandparent visitation petition directly, explaining that my parents had filed legal action seeking court-ordered access to my son after I had established these boundaries, and that the court had dismissed their petition after reviewing evidence that included their failure to respond during my medical emergency. I made clear that my boundaries were not about punishment or vindictiveness, but about recognizing that relationships that require you to constantly sacrifice your own well-being to maintain them are not healthy relationships regardless of the biological connection involved. I ended the post by stating that I did not expect this information to change anyone's opinion about the situation, that people were free to maintain whatever relationships they chose, but that I wanted my own perspective available for anyone interested in understanding the full context. I emphasized that I was not interested in debating or defending my choices, that I had made peace with the consequences of prioritizing my health, and that I wished my family well while maintaining firm boundaries around my own life and my son's. The response to this post was immediate and divided. Some people expressed shock at learning about my medical emergency and my family's response, reaching out with genuine support and offers of practical help. Others remained loyal to my family's narrative, suggesting that I was airing private family business inappropriately, or that there must be more to the story than I was sharing. A few people who had experienced similar dynamics in their own families sent me long private messages describing their own struggles with establishing boundaries and thanking me for being willing to speak openly about family dysfunction that usually remained hidden behind facades of normalcy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.